In this video, I'll be covering the Adeptus Mechanicus, or AdMech for short. Like I said in my Tau video, I'm going to discuss some core mechanics to the army and the sub-factions before I delve any further into the units. The main mechanic that makes the AdMech different to other armies is the canticles of the Omnissiah. The way this works is at the start of each battle round, the AdMech player can either choose a buff from a table, or roll a d6 to randomly generate the buff that will affect your AdMech units. If the player decides to choose a canticle, they cannot choose the same canticle again unless they use a stratagem that allows them to do that. They instead have to roll for all of them. This stratagem can also be used at any point in the battle round, rather than just at the start of the battle round, so if you need to change your canticles mid-round, then you can do that. Out of the canticles, I think most people would agree that Shroud Psalm is the best, as it puts your whole army in cover. It is pretty bad against armies that get the ability to ignore the effects of cover, so bear that in mind when choosing or rolling your canticles. A lot of other canticles don't massively impact the army, or can be easily acquired by auras and war gear. Canticles did get a good buff in the recent Psychic Awakening. It allows you to choose to replace one of the base canticles with one from the Psychic Awakening book. You'll find you're usually replacing Litany of the Electromancer, as that is by far the worst one. Which canticle you get from the Psychic Awakening book will depend on which sub-faction you have put your warlord in. The ones I like the most are the ones from Graia, Lucius, and Mars. And in particular I like Mars's, as it gives all your heavy weapons a bit more strength and allows them to move and fire without the heavy weapon penalty. It also synergizes with playing Mars, as Mars gets to generate an extra canticle every turn. Now, let's talk a bit more about those sub-factions, or Forge Worlds to use the correct term. Most Forge Worlds have pretty good effects, with probably the best being Stygies 8, as getting -1 to hit and your whole army is pretty nasty, seeing as you only lose that effect when enemies get in close range. Do note, while having 2 canticles isn't fantastic, there are a lot of good reasons to take Mars as your Forge World, and thus ends up in a fair few competitive lists. Like the Tau, the AdMech can make their own Forge World traits, but instead of just choosing any 2 traits, they instead choose a primary trait and then a secondary trait which corresponds to the primary trait. Unfortunately, unlike Tau, I find these traits kind of weak. The AdMech already have some decent traits, and these are either too specialised or too weak. Often I find the primary and secondary trait do not really complement each other that well, which ends up with some of your army getting no bonuses and the rest just getting small buffs. So in the end, I think you should just stick to the generic Forge Worlds. Maybe you could make a small detachment of one of them. I know one particular one that people like the look of is giving vehicles 5-up feel no pain, and making arc weapons explode on 5s and 6s. So bearing all that in mind, let's go into the star ratings so we can get onto the review. A 1-star unit is ineffective at what it tries to do. It is either overcosted, tries to do something the army isn't built to do, or is completely outshined by other units. A 2-star unit is an okay unit. Typically they are outshined by 3-star units, or require significant support to make work. A 3-star unit is a solid unit in casual play. They may come up in the occasional competitive lists, although it is very rare to see them. A 4-star unit will occasionally come up in winning competitive lists, often as a tech choice or dependent on the player's playstyle. And finally, a 5-star unit is often seen in winning competitive lists. Before we go any further, I am making this list based off of 8th edition rules. I will note if I think any unit will significantly improve or get worse in 9th. However, it will not be easy to tell, as most of the points values are going to change, which will significantly alter any unit's playability. Oh, and I'm not covering any knights in this review. They may be in the Codex, but it will be better to have them in their own video. So let's get started in 1 star, with the Cybernetica Datasmith. The Datasmith offers a bit of firepower from his strong pistol and a bit of melee from his power fist. He also has the ability to change the Castellan Robots protocols at the start of every turn. I'll be going into what the protocols are in the Castellan Robots section, but all you need to know is there is a stratagem that allows you to guarantee the changing of protocols, albeit forcing them to stay in that mode. The problem is he doesn't offer anything more than that. The ability to repair Castellan Robots can be done by pretty much any tech priest, who can also repair the other vehicles as well. The only other thing going for the Datasmith is the Vigilus detachment, which gives you a Warlord trait that allows you to heal D6 instead of D3, a relic that allows you to change the protocols from a longer range, and a couple of stratagems that only really help the Castellans. All in all, not that impressive, and using this guy is just point inefficient. Next up is X-101 from Blackstone Fortress. It is an expensive servitor with servitor level ballistic and weapon skill. Also like servitors, it can improve these by having a tech priest sit by it, and it also gets additional hit to targeting vehicles, but the problem is that both the gun is too short range and has too little strength to be super effective against vehicles. The melee option has better strength but almost no AP, making it pretty ineffective against vehicles. Against most other targets, the low volume of shots and attacks just makes it inefficient at killing anything. The final nail in the coffin is the inability to absorb shots, and not being a character despite being a single model unit. Lastly in 1 star is the Archaeo Transvector. I think it's a waste of points due to its extremely limited transport capacity, meaning it can only carry a small squad of Skitarii infantry. I recommend the Scorpius Dune Rider over this 99 times out of 100. The extra mobility is really nice, but with the complete inability to deliver anything meaningful into the enemy's lines, you're kinda just blowing 100 points on some really light armaments and dropping a tiny squad to their deaths. If a small squad could do more, like with Space Marines, this would probably be at least worth looking at, but as it currently stands, it's just far too weak to make this work. Moving on now into 2 stars, we start with the Sakaran Rust Stalkers. Before Psychic Awakening and the release of the Dune Riders, these guys were almost completely outclassed by Infiltrators and the Electra Priests. However, now the Rust Stalkers have a method of getting in, they aren't quite as bad. With a large volume of attacks and the ability to do mortal wounds on 6s, they can really cut through things. The only thing that scares me about these, apart from transports being the only way to get them in, is the lack of AP on their melee weapons. This does mean when you're hitting tougher targets, you're unlikely to get past the high save. However, there eventually becomes a point where your opponent's invuln save is so high that it's better to spam mortal wounds and large volumes of attacks at them, which is where the Rust Stalkers start becoming good again. Most of the time these units come in limited numbers, unless you're playing against Custodes, so most of the time these guys aren't fantastic. Next in 2 stars is the Cerberus Sulphur Hounds. These guys have a bunch of cover-ignoring pistols, a cover-ignoring flamer pistol, and the option for an assault 4 strength 5 gun, all with AP -1. So what's there to dislike? Well, firstly, it's the range. It's very short. They do have a long 12-inch movement and can advance with basically no penalty, which does somewhat mitigate it, but the next thing I dislike is how easily they die. Basically all of the non-Cataphron, non-vehicle things in AdMech have a toughness 3 and a 4-up save, and while Shroud Sum does help a little bit bumping up to 3-up, any cover-ignoring medium AP weapons or melee will just tear right through them. Furthermore, while they do have a melee option, the only member of the squad who will actually hit with any amount of power will be the Alpha. They all have 3 attacks, but those come mostly from the Hound, who only has strength 4 and no AP. The Power Maul does get to hit twice, but there's no point in charging into anything if you're only getting 2 good attacks off. The final problem with these guys is the price point. Each Sulphur Hound comes out at 18 points, except the Alpha, who comes out at 25 points. Furthermore, if you want to take that good Assault 4 gun, you have to pay 31 points for the model. It's insane. For how easily they'll die, this is just far too much. Rounding off 2 stars is the Archaeopter Fuselav. Yes, the bomber of the flyer trio. It, like all the AdMech flyers, are incredibly maneuverable, being able to turn twice. This especially helps the Fuselav as it needs to maneuver over enemies to bomb them. The reason it ends up being this low though is that the damage is very unimpressive. Dealing half the unit size and mortal wounds is quite good for taking out single wound troops, especially those in large squad sizes. However, it gets capped at 10, so you're doing 5 mortal wounds on average to those units of 10 or larger. You do get to roll 3 dice for vehicles and monsters, but almost all of those units come in unit sizes of 1, which means this is effectively a worse way of trying to deal D3 mortal wounds. Apart from the bombs, the plane has 12 bolter equivalent shots, which don't really amount to much. This unit is definitely on the lower side of 2 stars. Next up, we have the 3-star units, starting with the Tech Priest Manipulus. This is an old meta choice where you could give an extra 3 inches to your Cataphron's flamethrowers to keep your army from being continuously tied up in combat. Unfortunately, this has been nerfed down to only 2 inches of increased range, which while isn't a huge nerf, still makes the charges easier for your opponent. They didn't nerf the extra 6 inches you give to weapons of 24 inches or more though, but the increases range is less significant as a proportion for longer range weapons. To be fair, you don't have to choose the range increase ability. You can alternatively choose the ability to add 1 inch to moves, advances and charges of all nearby units. This is quite nice if you have some foot slogging troops, or if you put the Manipulus in a transport with some melee units, and they all hop out and charge or something. This probably favours the Manipulus more, as it actually puts him in range of his much shorter range weapons. He is pretty squishy though, and is liable to getting blown up if the troops he is with all get killed as well. He carries the repair ability that all the Tech Priests have, allowing him to restore D3 wounds to an AdMech units, or 1 wound to Mechanicus Knights. However, there are much cheaper ways of getting this, and much stronger units in the HQ slot. Next up is the Servitors. Strangely high, you might think, especially if you see my Astra Militarum tier list. Well, there is a specific way you can use them over just a cheap elite slot filler, like they are in the Guard. Using a Vigilus attachment, you can eat them to build Cataphrons. Using the Master of Biosplicing Warlord trait, you can kill 1 Servitor and either restore D3 wounds or bring 1 Cataphron back to life at 1 wound. As both this and the Master of Machines ability, that's the repair one, trigger at the end of the movement phase, you can choose which order these abilities activate. You can heal a Cataphron, then build another. You can build 1 wound Cataphron, then heal it to full. It is worth noting that only the Tech Priest Dominus can use his Master of Machines ability like this and carry this Warlord trait. It is also worth remembering that the new Warlord traits with the Psychic Awakening are pretty darn good, and you probably want to look at one of those before you take this. Next up, in 3 stars, is the Corpuscarii Electro Priests. Firstly, I think the Necrons need to call their lawyers because the Admech have stolen their Tesla. Like the Necron Tesla, they get 3 hits rather than 1 on a roll of a 6 up. They also get this effect in melee, and both have strength 5, which is great for clearing out infantry. So how do we make the best use of this? Firstly, you'll need to throw them into a transport. This does limit their squad size, but it allows you to quickly get them up the board and get them in range of their short range weapons. Secondly, you need to improve that roll, so that 6 can trigger on 5s as well. To do this, you'll need the character Daedalosus, who has the ability to add 1 to shooting hit rolls against one enemy unit. Finally, to ensure whatever you're shooting at actually dies, you can slap the stratagem from Psychic Awakening book that gives them AP -2 to their shooting attacks. Very nice stuff. Their problems start at being forced into smaller squad sizes though. To make the best use out of the stratagem, and also make the best use out of the ability that lets them do mortal wounds when they finish a charge, they need to be at their max squad size of 20. Unfortunately, the biggest transport size is 12, which is with the Forge World Terminax Pattern Assault Drill model, which is still too small for a maximum size Corpuscarii squad. The other big problem is that their saves aren't great. They only have a 5-up invulnerable save and a 5-up feel no pain to help them not die. Toughness 3 and 1 wound mean that you can dump some anti-infantry fire into them and they'll just begin to evaporate. At least they aren't too huge of an investment, but the points lost will definitely begin to add up. Next up is the other Electro Priests, the Fulgurite Electro Priests. I think these guys are a little better than the Corpuscarii in some ways and a bit worse than others. These guys mostly suffer from the same issues as the Corpuscarii. In fact, their stat line abilities are almost the same, but they have an extra 2 points on them. So what are you getting for these 2 points? Well, you are losing the gun exploding 6s, but instead you're getting a strength 6 -2 AP D3 damage melee weapon with the ability to do mortal wounds instead of wounds on 6s. Pretty nasty stuff, but it gets better. The moment you wipe out a unit, they activate Beefcake mode and get a 3-up invulnerable save instead of their pitiful 5-up. These guys also have the benefit of having a better weapon skill than their Corpuscarii counterpart, which means they are more likely to wipe out a squad and get that 3-up invulnerable save. So I think these guys are better in most ways than Corpuscarii, but they still, once again as I said, suffer from the similar issues. The Sakaran Infiltrators are coming in at 3 stars. Once again, we have a pair of units with very similar stat line. The Infiltrators pair being Ruststalkers. The Ruststalkers even get an extra attack over the Infiltrators, so why do these guys get to be higher up? Well, first of all, they've got an inbuilt Deep Strike. They even have a decent weapon skill and weapons to back it up, choosing between a power sword for the AP or a taser goad for the extra strength and chance to do more hits. Secondly, and probably lastly in the upsides, is their guns. You can either choose the higher strength stub carbine or the higher volume of fire flechette blaster. Unfortunately, you can't choose the melee and gun independently of each other for some reason, but as far as my advice goes, I'd recommend the taser goad and flechette blaster most of the time. The extra AP from the power sword is really nice, but what you want out of the Infiltrators is a high volume of fire on the turn you drop them. The Flechette Blaster may have a lower strength, but when you drop the Wrath of Mars stratagem on your squad, any 6s are going to start doing mortal wounds. This is pretty much all you want to do to clear a small squad off of holding backline objectives, which is what the Infiltrators are there to do. Just remember that these guys are still quite squishy, having only toughness 3 and a 4-up save by default. You do get 2 wounds, which is nice for taking a bit of damage, but those wounds will disappear very quickly. Iron Strider Ballistari are up next in 3 stars. They are a pretty good skirmishing unit with anti-elite infantry or anti-tank weapons. I'm going to take the opportunity to say giving 2 different but still very similar weapon options isn't really giving players much decision or creative list building ability. Grumble, 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 grumble. But aside from all the grumbling, these guys are pretty simple in their usage. You advance them up the board and try to pick up the units you have specialised their guns into hitting. I will note that before Psychic Awakening they were a little worse because you'd suffer the penalty for moving and firing heavy weapons, but now with the new Mars Canticle, they can pretty reliably hit on their normal ballistic skill. They are offensively powerful, but trade that for some pretty mediocre defenses, having only a 4-up save, toughness 6 and 6 wounds. But I guess this is to be expected for a chassis that costs around 40 points. I would suggest bringing these guys in a Styges 8 detachment to boost their tankiness a bit. Remember, even if they are in a Styges detachment, they can still be affected by the Mars Canticle as long as the Warlord is in a Mars detachment. Next in 3 stars is the Taraxi Skystalkers. So the geniuses at the Admech decided to take their sneaky infiltration unit and slap a huge loud jetpack on them. Good job, guys. In all seriousness, this unit performs a very similar job to that of the regular infiltrators, to drop in the backline and unleash a crazy amount of firepower. While each Skystalker costs costs more than an infiltrator without war gear, with war gear they end up costing the same. So why choose one over the other? The Skystalkers don't carry any melee weapons except on their alpha, so if you're looking to tie up your opponents you'll want to stick with the infiltrators. The Skystalkers are instead intended for middle to longer range combat with their 24-inch flechette carbines and staying more mobile with their 12 inches of movement and the fly keyword. They can also swoop away and redeploy, but under the current deep strike rules that means you're going to be off the board for about half of the important 5 turns of the game. I think you'd usually prefer to have the extra firepower and objective capping power on the board. The Skystalkers also have the ability to bomb similar to that of a lot of planes. Against single wound models, you're going to kill a third of them on average, and as this bomb doesn't have a cap on how many models you can hit, you can drop this on your opponent's 30 orc boys and watch them complain about Games Workshop's rules writing. There is a slight bonus against vehicles, but doing one mortal wound to any vehicle is basically insignificant. If hordes were more meta, these guys would probably make it up into 4 stars, but in the current Marines meta, they don't really offer much more than the standard infiltrator squad. They also have a stratagem that forces an enemy to hit at -1, but it only affects a single squad, although it cannot be removed for any reason. For a single CP stratagem, it isn't the worst, especially if you can catch out an important unit. Finally, in 3 stars are the Cerberus Raiders. They are a mobile squad of snipers designed for picking off characters and getting out without being torn to shreds. Unfortunately, without fire and fade movement, they probably end up taking more firepower than they can handle after taking out an opponent's character. But can they make their points back before they get completely obliterated? It's not easy to say, but I'm more erring on the side of no than yes. Due to most of the squad being stuck with the galvanic carbine, any character they are shooting at is going to be getting their full save. You do get the sniper rule of 6 dealing mortal wounds, which considering they have an okay number of shots might trigger enough to kill a character. Although I actually prefer the Alpha's weapon, which is a very nasty pistol much better designed for killing, having AP and 2 damage, which is typically enough to force them onto an invuln save. Part of me wishes the whole squad could take these, so you could have a full squad of saber and revolver toting cowboy admechs. But alas, we live in a world without this. The last thing that stands out about them is their melee weapons, which are actually pretty good, as they have the high mobility to support it. 12-inch move, especially combined with their vanguard deploy, means they can get into your opponents very quickly, and hit stuff with their cavalry sabers. Where it suffers is that every member of the squad only has 1 attack with their good saber, and then have to make 2 attacks with the slightly worse clawed limbs. All of these have to hit on a 4-up as well, which just sucks. Now we move on into 4 stars. We'll start with the Cataphron Breachers. Both Cataphrons cost a fair whack, with the Breachers being the cheaper of the 2 and still costing 30 points per Cataphron. They have a fairly limited number of shots, which kinda sucks, especially seeing as they only have a 4-up ballistic and weapon skill. But that's where the bad stuff ends. Breachers are tough, having multiple wounds and a good save, and toughness 5 to boot. The weapons the Breachers carry are extremely high power, carrying good AP, strength and damage. Even their melee weapons aren't bad. They have pretty average movement, albeit limited when advancing, and they get to move and fire their heavy weapons without any penalty, so they're somewhat maneuverable. Finally, they can shoot at a better ballistic skill if you use the stratagem either in the Vigilist attachment that allows them to get +1 to hit when they're near a tech priest, or in the base book, which is if they're next to Castellans. Or you could use both. All in all, they're a pretty good killer unit. Next up in 4 stars is the Skitarii Vanguard. The Admech has a pretty strong selection of troops, and out of them, this is the weakest. They are reasonably cheap at 8 points per model, but they are beaten out by the Rangers, which are a point cheaper. They have an okay weapon, which dumps out a respectable number of shots, but not as many as an infiltrator. Finally, they have the ability to reduce the toughness of units they are melee with by 1, as long as they are not a vehicle. If you can send them in with a unit capable of hitting hard in melee, then I guess they can assist them in the combat, because the Vanguard really lack any melee weapons beyond the Alpha. The best use for them is definitely to throw some plasma calivers on them, and use them to blow up some tougher enemies, and use the rest of the squad to soak up shots for the calivers. Do note that as squad size gets larger, leadership does begin to matter more and more. You can throw an enhanced data tether to try and re-roll leadership, or keep a unit with either a command uplink or a broad spectrum data tether nearby. Now we move on to the Scorpius Dune Rider. It's really odd to see a transport come this high, but Admech struggle to get their melee units in through Deep Strike, and the Dune Rider is actually pretty well priced for how tanky it is. You can use these to transport your Rangers, Vanguard, and characters around the board to get them to places they need to be, such as objectives, and in the case of characters and Vanguards, put them in range of their weapons. The only thing to do with the transport itself I can complain about is that it is capped at 10, which while convenient for a max-sized squad of Vanguards, is pretty inconvenient for the Electro Priests whose max squad size is 20, and also for the Rust Stalkers as well. And they really want to be at their maximum squad size, and need a good way of getting in. Also, the vehicle looks like it should have open topped, but it doesn't. Dune Rider also carries some light armaments they can use to plink wounds off of infantry as they drive to where they want to be. It's all nice stuff, and it doesn't cost too much. The last thing to note is that it carries a broad spectrum data tether, which helps the leadership a little, which is nice. Right, now this one is a tough call. I'm cautiously saying that the Taraxi sterilizers are 4 stars. I usually dunk on flaming units, but unless I'm seriously missing something, I think these guys are pretty good. Flamethrowers are usually pretty inconsistent, but when you have 9 of them in a full squad, the rolls average out most of the time. What's better is these flamethrowers have a 12-inch range, meaning they can shoot as soon as they come out of deep strike, and makes them really hard to charge. These flamethrowers come with a point of AP, and also ignore cover, like most flamethrowers really should. The sterilizers are also pretty nasty in melee, assuming you can get the charge. A full squad has 31 attacks on the charge, all hitting at strength 5, except the Alpha, who hits at strength 6. Just try not to keep them in combat for longer than the charge, unless the unit you're charging really wants to retreat. This is because you lose both a point of strength and an extra attack if you are either charged or stuck in melee. It's not the end of the world, but I definitely think you need to pick your charge targets wisely with the sterilizers. If the unit you charge really does want to retreat, or you need to keep the sterilizers in combat to prevent them from being shot up, there is a stratagem that forces your opponent to stay in melee. But why does this effect trigger on a 2-up? It's so dumb! The last thing of note is the redeploy, which happens in the same way that the Skystalkers do it. But as I said, I think you're better off keeping the firepower on the board. I think these guys are actually a pretty good investment for 9th, because unless their points skyrocket, they're going to be a good unit to choose for Overwatch, and they're also pretty good melee combatants themselves, which 9th seems to be pushing towards. Next up is the Archaeopter Stratoraptor. The final and fighter variant of the planes is definitely my favourite of the trio. So it acts like all other planes and doesn't have any special abilities. The thing that separates it from the rest is the 2 heavy phosphor blasters and the twin Cognis las cannons. These weapons give the firepower you need to dish out some serious damage to basically anything you point this at. The phosphor blaster will tear through some elite infantry with a good number of shots at a good strength with some AP attached, and the 2 twin las cannons are just 2 las cannons strapped together. It being highly maneuverable means that it can keep on target and also escape without being destroyed. All great stuff. And until 9th edition you can cant for the Mars Canticle because it does normally suffer for the penalty for moving and firing heavy weapons. We'll also struggle to stay within any reroll auras, so it might not do as much damage as a backline artillery piece. I'm going to talk quickly about the bits of the Archaeopters that I kinda glossed over. Firstly, there's a command uplink that allows nearby units to get its leadership 9. It's far too short range to make good use out of it, especially seeing as your army is a lot slower than the plane. It does get the abilities to turn off auras though with a stratagem, so that's pretty cool. You can replace the uplink with a chaff launcher that reduces the damage by 1 to a minimum of 1, which is nice for keeping the plane in the air for a little longer, but it does come at a fairly hefty cost though, so I'll probably not take it unless my opponent's anti-air did a lot of 2, D3 or 3 damage. Finally, all the planes can hover, which is nice if you don't want to run it off the board, or if it can't avoid getting the move and fire heavy weapons penalty. Finally, in 4 stars is the Castellan robots. I'm going to put a quick warning here and say that these are probably one of the most dangerous and at the same time one of the biggest trap units there are in the Codex. In a well-designed map, there are no points in the map where any unit can see the majority of the map, i.e. there will always be line-of-sight blocking terrain that stops a unit from just mowing down everything from your army. This is the very reason why Castellan robots are one of the biggest trap units. The Protector Protocol allows you to double the number of shots from your guns, which is absolutely insane, especially considering they can have 9 shots with their heavy phosphor blasters. This comes at the cost of being able to move. If you've heard me complain about the fortification units or terrain units, you should know how I feel about units being unable to move. Now, you don't have to put them in Protector Protocol, nor do you have to keep them in Protector Protocol if you have a Cybernetic Data Smith, but to get full value out of them, you probably will want to put them in Protector Protocol at some point. Find the best sightline you can and hold it. Your opponent basically cannot put any units in line of sight unless they either kill the robots the turn they peek their heads out, or if they have some sort of death wish. But that's enough about the Protector Protocol. There is in fact 2 other protocols. There is the Aegis Protocol, which is the one they start in. This gives them +1 to all their saves, including their invulnerable save. This makes them stupidly tanky, although considering they come out about 100 points per model, it's actually pretty understandable. Note that they do have the ability to deal a mortal wound back to a unit firing at them on an unmodified roll of 6. Aegis does not improve this chance, so don't be too scared to shoot some anti-tank at them before they can get into Protector Protocol. Typically you want to avoid shooting your infantry anti-tank and want to stick with anti-tank tanks to deal with them, seeing as it's much more harmful to have your infantry killed with the 1 mortal wound being dealt back. Finally, there's the Conqueror Protocol, which allows you to fight twice. So there is a super secret punchy bot loadout you can take on the Castellans, which is why this protocol exists. Actually, the super secret punchy robot model is the default, but that's besides the point. The punches hit pretty hard, but they're bit too vulnerable while getting up the board to make good use out of it. They're going to be a pretty big and obvious target for your opponent to destroy. Finally, when you get in, you're only getting 6 attacks out of your punchy bots. It's good for destroying tanks, but if you get tar-pitted against any infantry, you're in for a bad time. What's even worse is they lose their invulnerable save in melee, meaning they can get torn to shreds by good melee combatants with any amount of AP. Yeah, I strongly recommend you keep them in Dakka bot mode rather than punch bot mode. Finally, we move on into 5 stars, starting with Belisarius Cawl. He's a big, expensive named character, but he's good enough for a lot of people to take Mars. His guns and melee are alright and can threaten anyone that gets into close range, but his main value comes from his abilities. Firstly, he can reroll any hit rolls for any Mars units nearby him. This range gets increased when you make him your warlord, which is probably what you want to do seeing as he's quite tough to take down. Secondly, and probably much more importantly, he can modify your canticles by 1. This means that you have a 50% chance of getting any canticle you want except 1 and 6. Seeing as 1 and 6 aren't super important, and once you replace Litany of the Electromancer with literally any other Forge World canticles, 2 to 5 are all at least good, assuming you have some melee in your army, so this bonus is actually pretty darn good. The final thing that makes Cawl good is the ability to heal any Imperium thing. While he does heal Adeptus Mechanicus stuff better than Imperium stuff, he can still stick wounds back onto Grueman, Leman Russes, Ogryns, or even Custodes. He must carry a lot of tools under that cloak of his. Next up is the Tech Priest Dominus. The Tech Priest Dominus is extremely straightforward. He has the Captain effect, which allows him to reroll hit rolls of 1, although it only applies to shooting attacks. Apart from that, there's not really a ton more to him. He can heal like every other Tech Priest. Note that these heals only apply to any multi-wound model in the AdMech. Can also carry a decent selection of mid to short range weaponry, and it's all alright. It's weird, there's not really much to talk about this model, and yet it makes it so high. Sometimes a model just doesn't need to do a ton to be a strong staple in an army. Next up in 5 stars is the Tech Priest Engine Seer. These guys are your cheap HQ option. In fact, they are absurdly cheap at only 30 points per model. They do have a wanting ballistic and weapon skill, but considering their minimal equipment, they really aren't meant to be fighters. Actually, they aren't really meant to do much except repair. They do get to heal Imperial Guard vehicles at D3, which is nice, but once again, this is just a really basic model with not a ton of complexity to it. It is worth noting they are part of the cheapest battalion detachment possible with Imperial Soup. Taking 2 of these guys and 3 minimum sized squads of Rangers allows you to get 5 command points for 165 points. This just beats out the Loyal 32 by 15 points. But the reason the Loyal 32 is so popular is due to the better internal synergy of the Guard, and the large number of bodies you get with Guardsmen, as well as the better relics for command point generation. In 9th, these guys are going to be a lot worse due to the lack of necessity for CP batteries, so don't overinvest in them. Daedalus is a pretty simple 5-star unit. He shores up the weaknesses of your lower ballistic skill models, giving them +1 to hit in the shooting phase if they target a unit that Daedalosus selects. The unit that Daedalosus selects has to be within 24 inches and visible to Daedalosus, but that isn't an extreme requirement. Daedalus is also not faction restricted, and points wise, he's quite cheap, so you can slot him in basically anywhere. The only other notable thing about his kit is his RKO device, which allows him to heal D3 wounds to a friendly AdMech unit within 3 inches, or deal D3 mortal wounds to an enemy unit within 3 inches. This can only happen once per battle, so he can't heal as well as the normal AdMech HQs, but at the end of the day, he's still an incredibly solid option. Next up is the Skitarii Rangers. They are your cheap troops choice. They aren't the cheapest troop choice, but they make up for it by having a good weapon range and strength, and the ability to get some AP when they get wounds rolls of 6s. All in all, a pretty good backline objective holder. They can take the same set of weapons as Vanguard, but I'd recommend throwing in a couple of transuranic arquebuses instead of using the plasma calivers. You can instead slam on arc rifles if you actually want to move the Rangers, but if you're keeping them back, the higher strength, AP, and ability to target characters will really help picking things off as they come to you. I do have some slight reservations about taking too many arquebuses because 40k is a game that requires mobility, which the arquebuses do not allow you to have. Catapult destroyers come in at 5 stars, unsurprising considering how much firepower they bring to the table. They are expensive, especially for troops, but they all have high strength, good AP weapons. They don't have a ton of damage on them unless you supercharge the plasma or are hitting things with a 3-up or better save with their grav cannon. It is worth noting that the overcharging plasma is quite dangerous unless you can get +1 to a hit to ensure the plasma won't kill you. Losing a destroyer to overcharge plasma is a good way to burn through tanky points, so be careful. Apart from that, Catapons have a second choice between Flamers and Phosphor Blasters. Personally, I'd save the point and accept the slightly worse Overwatch, so choose the Phosphor Blasters. If your destroyers are getting charged, there's probably a lot more going wrong that can't just be fixed by killing a couple of models in Overwatch. I will also note these guys are stuck with a pretty mediocre 4-up save, which leaves them to being vulnerable to being taken apart with mild amounts of AP. Sidonian Dragoons are next in 5 stars. You take these guys to advance up the board, contest objectives in the middle, and tie up shooting units. They're actually quite cheap for their toughness and wounds, and what makes them stand out additionally is they have an inbuilt -1 to hit that makes them incredibly annoying to kill unless you can get them into melee. Unfortunately, melee is where these guys want to be. Having a great strength 8, damage 2, and exploding 6s, these guys will munch through most things they touch. The low volume of attacks does mean that you can get caught up in combat with swarms that can leave them bogged down unless you can get really lucky with some 6s to hit. The final good thing about these guys is the ability to put them in Styges 8, which gives them an additional -1 to hit, rounding out to a nice -2 to hit. If you've watched my video on 9th, you'll know firstly that this is going to be limited to -1 next edition, and secondly that I think army-wide minuses to hit are really dumb. This is no exception here. Anyway, moving on to the Scorpius Disintegrator. As a sort of main battle tank of the AdMech, it does a pretty darn good job. They can carry a decent amount of firepower, but the main reason why these guys are so popular is the Belleros energy cannon. Having a good range, good strength, a bit of AP, 2 damage, and most importantly of all, the ability to shoot units out of line of sight. This means your disintegrators will go from a powerful battle tank to a mobile artillery piece. Admittedly, they're not as good as the guard artillery, this mainly comes down to the guard having more options that can clear out more stuff. The Belleros is clearly meant for wiping out elite infantry and Primaris things. Before we move on, I will note that the stratagem isn't too useful on either loadout of the disintegrator, because shooting 3 Cognus heavy stubbers into a tank, or shooting either of the high power weapons onto light infantry is just a waste of your shooting phase. Split fire to maximise the amount of damage you can do. Finally, we tie off the list with the Onager Dune Crawler. Now, Games Workshop, listen, this is how you want to do weapon options. Several main gun options, some light support equipment choices, and some support choices. Very good stuff. While I do like options, there are clearly some that are better than others, so there's room for improvement here. So let's go through them one at a time, starting with the default Eradication Beamer. It matches nearly all the other weapons for points, but it lacks the range and power of the longer range options. The power does go up if you move within 12 inches, but then it only just matches the neutron laser. Next up is the Icarus Array. This is supposed to be an anti-air option, as it gains a to hit against anything with fly, but loses a hit to anything without it. This only cancels out the hard to hit effect, but it's still nice to have, especially against things without that effect. It does seem such a waste though to waste such high power weapons against just planes though. Oh wait, you can use the Protector Doctrina Imperative, which adds 2 to your hit rolls on Onager Dune Crawlers if you take the broad spectrum data tether, which you probably want to do because it's free. This both cancels out the minuses to hit and adds 1 to the hit roll, so very good stuff. This thing can shoot at basically whatever you want. I guess it's not too great against toughness 8 things, but you have all that good AP, so you can take things down with it. Next up is the Neutron Laser. This, while your most expensive option, should probably be your default option. It carries an extra heavy stubber, which is good for a little bit of extra DACA, but more importantly is your main weapon, which has a great strength 10 and AP -4. But what really sells it for me is the consistency on the damage. D6 minimum 3 is such a nice way of bringing consistency to weapons without adding a ton of shots or just putting plus damage on it. It means that you can expect to do 3 damage, but there's always a bit of extra variance. Please, let this be applied to other D6 damage weapons. Anyway, let's finish off the weapons with the Twin Heavy Phosphor Blaster. It's not very good. And that's the review. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, feel free to drop a like. If you want to see more factions or just more videos like this, I'd appreciate it if you could give a subscription. If you feel like I missed something or just want to contribute to the discussion, leave a comment down below. And finally, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching.